The notification sound from my phone cut through the morning silence like a knife. I was standing in my kitchen in Portland, Oregon, steam rising from my coffee mug, when I saw the bank alert that would shatter my world in seconds. Our joint account balance, negative $412. Yesterday, it had $23,000 in it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My hands trembled as I opened the banking app, watching transaction after transaction scroll past my disbelieving eyes. Hospital payments, medical fees, and one final transfer labeled simply as Emergency Surgery Fund v. Cole. But it wasn't the empty account that destroyed me. It was the text message that followed 30 minutes later from my husband Daniel. "Don't worry about the money, she's worth more than you ever were." Little did he know I had been planning something he never saw coming. My name is Rachel Thompson, and at 35 I thought I had built the perfect life. I'm a graphic designer with a passion for capturing Portland's moody landscapes through my weekend photography adventures. My husband Daniel, a software engineer with kind eyes and an infectious smile, seemed to complement my creative spirit with his logical, steady approach to life. We lived in a charming two-story house in Beaverton, complete with a small garden where I grew herbs and Daniel tinkered with his weekend carpentry projects. Our morning routine was sacred. I'd wake up first, brew our favorite local coffee blend, and we'd sit on our back porch planning our day while watching the Oregon mist roll across our neighborhood. Daniel worked for a growing tech startup downtown, often staying late to meet deadlines, while I had recently been promoted to senior designer at a creative agency in the Pearl District. Our financial situation was comfortable, nothing extravagant, but we had managed to save a decent emergency fund and were even discussing starting a family soon. Every month we'd have our money meetings over dinner, reviewing our joint account, planning for future goals, and dreaming about the vacation home we wanted to buy near Mount Hood. Daniel always praised my organizational skills, joking that he'd be lost without my spreadsheets and color-coded budget plans. Our weekends were filled with hiking the Columbia River Gorge, exploring Portland's endless food truck scene, and hosting dinner parties for our close-knit group of friends. Daniel had this way of making everyone feel welcome, telling stories that had our guests laughing until their sides hurt. I loved watching him in those moments, seeing the man I fell in love with during our college days at Oregon State University. We had met in a computer lab where I was struggling with a design software assignment, and he had quietly offered to help. That gentle kindness never seemed to fade, even after 7 years of marriage. The foundation of our relationship was built on complete transparency and trust. We shared everything: bank accounts, passwords, dreams, and fears. Daniel knew about my anxiety around financial security, stemming from my childhood watching my parents struggle through multiple job losses. He had always been reassuring, promising that we were a team and that he'd never make major financial decisions without discussing them with me first. This promise felt especially important because my previous relationship had ended when my ex-boyfriend secretly racked up credit card debt in my name. Our social circle admired what we had built together. Lisa Chen, my best friend and coworker, often said we were her relationship goals. She'd watch Daniel surprise me with my favorite pastries from the local bakery, or notice how he always remembered to photograph my artwork at gallery openings, even when I forgot. My brother Michael would joke that Daniel had set the bar too high for all other husbands, the way he'd listen intently to my work stories and celebrate my small victories as if they were his own major achievements. The rhythm of our daily life felt secure and predictable in the best possible way. Daniel would leave for work around 8, kissing my forehead and reminding me to eat lunch because I had a tendency to get lost in design projects. I'd work from home twice a week, and he'd text me throughout those days, asking if I needed anything from downtown or sharing funny memes that reminded him of our inside jokes. Our evening conversations flowed easily from work challenges, to weekend plans, to our shared fascination with true crime podcasts. What I cherished most was our Sunday tradition of driving to different neighborhoods around Portland, me with my camera and Daniel with his patient willingness to stop whenever I spotted interesting light or architecture. He'd carry my equipment, suggest angles I hadn't considered, and always insisted on taking photos of me in action, claiming he was documenting my artistic genius for posterity. These photos filled albums in our living room, a visual timeline of adventures shared and memories created together. Our financial partnership reflected the same harmony as our personal relationship. We had established clear systems early in our marriage: joint account for shared expenses, individual accounts for personal spending, and mutual agreement required for any purchase over $200. Daniel appreciated my detail-oriented approach to budgeting, while I valued his optimistic view of our earning potential. We had successfully navigated buying our house, 2 car purchases, and several home improvement projects without a single financial argument. The trust between us ran so deep that we both had complete access to all accounts, passwords, and financial documents. Daniel often joked that I was the chief financial officer of our household, handling most of the day-to-day money management, while he focused on maximizing our income through his career advancement. This division of responsibilities worked perfectly because we both felt secure knowing that all decisions were made transparently and with our shared future in mind. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was to believe that such contentment could exist without hidden complexities. Our life felt like a carefully crafted photograph, beautiful, balanced, and seemingly permanent. I had no reason to question the late nights at work, the increased focus on his phone, or the subtle changes in our daily interactions that I dismissed as natural evolution in a long-term marriage. The morning that everything changed started like any other. Daniel kissed me goodbye, mentioned he might be late due to a client deadline, and promised to pick up groceries on his way home. I had a full day planned: client meetings, a project deadline, and dinner preparations for Lisa, who was coming over to help me plan my upcoming photography exhibition. The routine felt comfortably familiar, and I moved through my morning with the confidence that comes from a life built on solid ground. I remember humming while I worked, excited about the exhibition opportunity and already planning how Daniel and I would celebrate this career milestone. My photography had evolved from a weekend hobby to something that galleries were beginning to notice, and Daniel's enthusiastic support had given me the courage to pursue this dream more seriously. He had even suggested using some of our savings to invest in better equipment, showing the same generous spirit that had attracted me to him years ago. The morning sunlight streamed through our kitchen windows, illuminating the small potted herbs that Daniel had surprised me with the previous week. Everything in our home reflected the partnership we had built, his practical touches combined with my aesthetic choices, creating a space that felt uniquely ours. The coffee maker he had researched and purchased, the dining table I had refinished, the gallery wall of photographs documenting our adventures together. As I prepared to leave for work, I felt that familiar gratitude for the life we had created. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of morning activity from our neighbors, and I took a moment to appreciate the peace that comes from feeling completely secure in your relationship and your shared future. Little did I know that within hours, this carefully constructed world would begin to crumble, revealing truths that would force me to question everything I thought I knew about the man I had loved and trusted completely. The drive to my office took me through the heart of Portland, past the coffee shops and food trucks that had become integral to our weekend adventures. I found myself already planning the weekend ahead, thinking about new hiking trails to explore and wondering if Daniel would be interested in checking out the farmers market in Southeast. These simple anticipations, the automatic assumption that our future would unfold as predictably as our past, now seem almost heartbreakingly innocent. My workspace at the creative agency buzzed with the familiar energy of deadline pressure and collaborative creativity. Lisa was already at her desk, and we exchanged our usual morning catch-up about everything from client challenges to weekend plans. She mentioned wanting to meet someone like Daniel, and I felt that warm pride that comes from having a partner who genuinely impresses the people you care about. The conversation flowed easily into work topics, and I settled into my projects with the focused energy that comes from feeling balanced and supported in all areas of life. The hours passed quickly, as they always did when I was absorbed in design work. Clients called with feedback, colleagues stopped by to brainstorm ideas, and I lost track of time in that productive way that made me love my career. It wasn't until late morning that I decided to check my phone, more out of habit than any concern. The banking notification sat there innocuously, just another digital interruption in an otherwise normal day. But as I read the numbers, as I processed what they meant, I felt the first crack appear in the foundation of everything I had believed about my life, my marriage, and my future. The banking app crashed twice before I could fully process what I was seeing. $23,000 gone in a matter of hours, transferred to accounts I didn't recognize, with medical terminology I couldn't understand. My fingers moved frantically across the screen, refreshing the page again and again, hoping this was some kind of technical error. But the transactions remained stubbornly real, each one a digital scar, across our carefully maintained financial security. I called Daniel immediately, my heart hammering against my ribs, as his phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. His cheerful recorded voice felt like a mockery now, that familiar tone I had heard thousands of times suddenly sounding foreign and deceptive. I tried again and again, leaving increasingly frantic messages that started with confusion and quickly escalated to barely controlled panic. Lisa noticed my distress from across the office and rushed over, her concern evident as she saw my pale face and shaking hands. I showed her the banking app, watching her expression shift from confusion to alarm as she processed the numbers. She immediately suggested calling the bank, insisting this had to be some kind of fraud or identity theft. The logical part of my mind wanted to believe her, wanted to cling to any explanation that didn't involve the man I trusted completely betraying that trust so thoroughly. The call to Pacific Northwest Credit Union was a nightmare of hold music and transfers between departments. When I finally reached a representative who could access our account, her professional tone couldn't mask the uncomfortable pause before she explained that all transactions had been authorized using Daniel's login credentials and security information. Each transfer had been initiated from his registered device, at times when I knew he was supposed to be at work.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Supposedly focused on client projects and team meetings. Patricia Wells, the branch manager, agreed to meet with me that afternoon, her voice kind but cautious as she explained the bank's policies regarding joint accounts. The drive to the branch felt surreal, Portland's familiar streets blurring past my windows, as I struggled to make sense of what was happening. The radio played our favorite local station, the same music Daniel and I had listened to countless mornings, now sounding discordant and strange. The bank's interior felt oppressively formal, after the casual comfort of my workplace. Mrs. Wells was a professional woman in her 50s, with sympathetic eyes, who led me to a private office filled with the institutional smell of new carpet and coffee. She spread printouts across her desk, each page documenting another piece of my financial security being stripped away. The timestamps showed a methodical approach, transfers spaced carefully to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. What disturbed me most was the evidence of planning. These weren't impulsive transactions made in a moment of crisis. Daniel had researched the bank's transfer limits, structured the withdrawals to maximize the amounts, while minimizing detection, and used medical emergency codes that would expedite processing. This level of calculation suggested weeks, or even months of preparation, a systematic dismantling of our shared future that he had orchestrated while still kissing me goodnight, and discussing our weekend plans. Mrs. Wells explained that one of the largest transfers had gone directly to St. Vincent Medical Center, specifically to the cosmetic surgery department. The payment had been made for a procedure scheduled for someone named Vanessa Cole, a name that meant nothing to me, but had obviously meant enough to Daniel to risk everything we had built together. The medical terminology on the invoice suggested an elective procedure, not the emergency surgery that would justify such desperate financial measures. I left the bank with copies of every transaction, and a growing certainty that my marriage was not what I had believed it to be. The afternoon sun felt harsh against my skin, as I sat in my car, staring at the documents that proved my husband had spent our entire emergency fund on another woman's surgery. The parking lot around me, filled with people going about their normal banking business, their casual conversations, and relaxed demeanor, a stark contrast to the chaos consuming my thoughts. Instead of returning to work, I drove home, needing the familiar comfort of our space to process what I had learned. But the house that had felt like a sanctuary that morning now seemed filled with hidden meanings and secret purposes. I wandered through rooms we had decorated together, searching for signs I had missed, clues that might explain how thoroughly I had misunderstood the man I had shared this space with for years. Daniel's home office drew my attention in ways it never had before. The room had always been his private workspace, and I had respected that boundary without question, trusting that his need for quiet focus was exactly what he claimed it to be. Now I found myself studying the space with new eyes, noticing how carefully organized his desk was, how securely his computer was password protected, and how few personal touches existed in a room where he supposedly spent so many hours. The dinner I had planned to make for Lisa sat forgotten in the refrigerator as I called her to explain I needed to cancel our evening plans. Her immediate offer to come over anyway touched me deeply, but I needed time alone to think, to process, and to decide what my next steps should be. The house felt simultaneously too large and too small, filled with memories that now carried different meanings and spaces that held secrets I was only beginning to discover. As evening approached, I positioned myself at our kitchen table with a clear view of the driveway, determined to confront Daniel the moment he returned home. The documents from the bank were spread before me, like evidence in a trial, each transaction a piece of a puzzle I was finally beginning to understand. The familiar sounds of our neighborhood, settling into evening routines, provided an oddly comforting backdrop to my growing clarity about the conversation that lay ahead. When Daniel's car finally pulled into our driveway, nearly 2 hours later than his usual arrival time, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The nervous energy that had consumed me all day crystallized into focused determination. I watched him gather his work bag and walk toward our front door with the same casual confidence he had displayed that morning, apparently unaware that his carefully constructed deception had finally been exposed. The sound of his key in the lock triggered a surge of adrenaline, but I remained seated at the kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal. His cheerful greeting called out from the entryway, the same warm tone he had used every evening for years, now sounding calculated and false. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his smile faltered immediately as he saw my expression and the bank documents arranged before me. The silence stretched between us for several long seconds, filled with the weight of questions I wasn't sure I was ready to hear answered. Daniel's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and what might have been relief, as he processed the scene before him. The man I had trusted completely, the partner I had believed incapable of deception, stood in our kitchen doorway, like a stranger wearing my husband's face. Daniel attempted to maintain normalcy, asking about my day and commenting on the unusual paperwork scattered across our table, but his voice carried a forced quality that I had never noticed before, a performance designed to buy time, while he assessed how much I knew and how he might explain it away. The casual dismissal in his tone, as if our empty bank account was merely an administrative oversight, sparked the first real anger I had felt since discovering the transactions. When I asked directly about the missing money, Daniel's explanation was a masterpiece of deflection and minimization. He spoke about emergency loans between friends, temporary transfers that would be repaid quickly, and medical crises that demanded immediate action. Each word was carefully chosen to sound reasonable, while revealing nothing concrete, a verbal dance designed to confuse rather than clarify. But I had spent all day preparing for this moment, and I wasn't going to be dismissed or distracted. I placed the bank statements directly in front of him, pointing to each transaction while demanding specific explanations. The cosmetic surgery payment, the multiple transfers to Vanessa Cole, the timing that coincided with his claimed work emergencies. As I spoke, I watched his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. Daniel's first admission came slowly, reluctantly, like pulling teeth from someone determined to reveal as little as possible. Yes, he knew Vanessa Cole. She was a colleague, a friend, someone who had found herself in a difficult situation requiring financial assistance. The story he wove was designed to cast himself as a compassionate friend, helping someone in crisis, rather than a husband betraying his wife's trust and their shared financial security. The details emerged piece by piece, each revelation more disturbing than the last. Vanessa wasn't just a colleague, but someone he had grown close to over several months of working together on various projects. Their friendship had deepened into something more meaningful, though he insisted it remained purely platonic. The surgery had been urgent, a medical necessity that her insurance wouldn't cover, and she had no family or other support system to turn to in her time of need. I listened to his explanations with growing disbelief, not at the story itself, but at his apparent conviction that I would find it acceptable. The man who had promised transparency in all financial matters was justifying spending our entire emergency fund on another woman without even consulting me. The partner who claimed to value our marriage above all else had prioritized a colleague's elective surgery over our shared financial security and mutual trust. What struck me most was Daniel's genuine surprise at my anger. He seemed to view his actions as noble and selfless, a demonstration of his character rather than a betrayal of our marriage. When I pressed him about the secrecy, the systematic deception, and the violation of our financial agreements, he responded with frustration that I wasn't appreciating his generous spirit and compassionate nature. The conversation continued deep into the evening, circling through the same points repeatedly as Daniel maintained his position that he had done nothing wrong while I struggled to understand how my husband had become someone I didn't recognize. The kitchen that had hosted so many comfortable conversations now felt like a courtroom where we were arguing different versions of reality. As midnight approached, Daniel finally acknowledged that perhaps he should have discussed the situation with me before taking action. This minimal concession felt inadequate given the magnitude of his deception, but it was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to receive. He assured me that Vanessa would repay the money as soon as she was able, though he couldn't provide any timeline or guarantee for when that might happen. The most chilling moment came when I asked if he would have made the same decision knowing how it would affect me, our marriage, and our financial security. After a long pause, Daniel answered with complete honesty that yes, he would have done exactly the same thing because Vanessa needed the help and he was in a position to provide it. In that moment, I understood that our marriage meant something fundamentally different to each of us. I spent that night in our guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling and processing the reality that the man sleeping down the hall was essentially a stranger to me. The Daniel I had married would never have risked our financial security without discussion. The partner I had trusted would never have maintained such elaborate deceptions while continuing to share meals, conversations, and intimate moments with me. The husband I had believed in would never have prioritized another woman's needs over our marriage. The following morning brought no resolution, only a strained politeness as we moved around each other in the kitchen like roommates rather than spouses. Daniel left for work with a casual kiss on my forehead and a promise that we would continue talking that evening, as if the previous night's revelations were merely a minor disagreement to be worked through with time and patience. But I was done talking. The man who had returned home the night before was not the person I had married, and no amount of conversation was going to bridge the gap between who I thought Daniel was and who he had revealed himself to be. As I prepared for another day at work, I found myself making mental lists of practical considerations. Bank accounts to separate, legal advice to seek, and conversations to have with the people who would need to know that my marriage was ending. The drive to work felt different that morning, not just because of what I had learned about Daniel, but because of what I had discovered about myself. I was stronger than I had realized, more capable of handling crisis than I had ever imagined, and more deserving of honesty and respect than I had been receiving. The woman who had panicked at the empty bank account the day before was evolving into someone who could take decisive action to protect herself and her future. Lisa was waiting at my desk when I arrived, her concerned expression immediately telling me that she had been worrying all night about my abrupt cancellation of our dinner plans. I gave her a brief overview of what I had learned, watching her anger grow as I described Daniel's casual justification for his financial betrayal. Her immediate offer of support and assistance reminded me that I wasn't facing this crisis alone. The workday passed in a blur of client calls and project deadlines that felt surreal given the personal chaos consuming my thoughts. But the familiar routine of professional responsibilities provided an anchor of normalcy that helped me think clearly about my options. By lunchtime, I had made several important decisions about my immediate future and the steps I needed to take to protect myself. My afternoon was spent researching divorce attorneys, opening an individual bank account, and making a list of shared assets that would need to be divided. Each practical step felt empowering, a reclaiming of control over my life and my future. The helpless panic of the previous day was transforming into focused determination to build a new life based on honesty and mutual respect. When I returned home that evening, Daniel was already there, apparently having left work early in an attempt to demonstrate his commitment to resolving our marital issues. He had prepared dinner and opened a bottle of wine, staging a romantic evening that felt like another manipulation rather than a genuine gesture of reconciliation. The gap between his actions and his understanding of what was actually happening continued to astound me. The text message arrived while we were sitting at our dining room table, Daniel attempting to recreate the intimate dinner conversations that had once felt so natural and comfortable. The notification sound from his phone interrupted his monologue about workplace stress and upcoming projects. As he glanced at the screen, I saw his expression change from casual interest to something approaching panic. Without thinking, he quickly turned the phone face down on the table, but not before I caught a glimpse of the sender's name. Vanessa Cole. The woman whose surgery had cost us our financial security was apparently still in regular contact with my husband, just hours after he had assured me that their relationship was purely professional and strictly limited to the medical emergency that had justified his deception. When I asked about the message, Daniel's response was immediate and defensive. Work emergency, urgent client matter, nothing that needed to interrupt our dinner conversation. But his body language told a different story, tension radiating from his shoulders as he made a visible effort not to look at his phone again. The casual dishonesty was breathtaking in its audacity, another layer of deception added to an already crumbling foundation of trust. I excused myself from the table, ostensibly to use the bathroom, but actually to compose myself and decide how to handle this latest revelation. The woman in the mirror looked tired but determined, someone who had finally seen enough evidence to stop making excuses for inexcusable behavior. When I returned to the dining room, Daniel was typing rapidly on his phone, his attention completely absorbed by whatever urgent communication couldn't wait until after our supposedly important conversation. The evening deteriorated from there, with Daniel making increasingly weak attempts to focus on our discussion, while clearly being distracted by ongoing text exchanges with someone he continued to claim was merely a professional colleague. By the time we went to bed, any pretense of normalcy had evaporated, replaced by a polite distance that felt more honest than the forced intimacy he had been attempting to maintain. I lay awake that night listening to Daniel's phone buzz repeatedly with incoming messages, each notification sound driving home the reality that my husband was more invested in his relationship with Vanessa Cole than in repairing the damage he had done to our marriage. The man sleeping beside me was prioritizing another woman's immediate needs over any consideration for my feelings or our future together. The next morning brought the text message that would finally shatter any remaining illusions about my marriage and Daniel's priorities. I was drinking coffee in our kitchen when my phone chimed with a notification that would change everything. The message was clearly intended for someone else, a misdirected text that revealed more truth than months of direct conversation had managed to extract. The words were simple but devastating in their clarity. Daniel had meant to reassure Vanessa about something, probably my reaction to discovering their financial arrangement, but had accidentally sent the message to me instead. Don't worry about the money. She's worth more than you ever were. 9 words that crystallized everything I had been struggling to understand about his behavior, his priorities, and his fundamental disrespect for our marriage. I screenshot the message immediately, knowing that this level of casual cruelty would be important evidence in the divorce proceedings that now seemed inevitable. The man who had shared my bed, my home, and my life for 7 years had just confirmed that he valued his relationship with another woman more than everything we had built together. There was no misunderstanding, no context that could soften the brutal honesty of his accidental revelation. The devastating clarity of that message marked the end of my confusion and the beginning of my transformation. I was no longer the bewildered wife trying to understand her husband's inexplicable behavior. I was a woman who had finally seen the truth about her marriage and was ready to take decisive action to reclaim her life, her dignity, and her future. Daniel had shown me exactly where I stood in his priorities, and I was finally ready to show him the consequences of that choice. The woman who had built her life around trust and partnership was about to become someone who prioritized her own worth and refused to accept anything less than the respect she deserved. The real story was just beginning, and for the first time in days, I felt powerful enough to write my own ending. The transformation wasn't just about ending my marriage to Daniel. It was about discovering who I could become when I stopped making excuses for people who didn't deserve my loyalty, when I stopped accepting crumbs from someone who was giving his best to another woman, and when I finally understood that my worth wasn't determined by his inability to see it. I spent that morning in a strange state of calm, moving through familiar routines while planning the systematic dismantling of the life I had thought I wanted. Each decision felt clean and clear, guided by a newfound certainty about what I would and wouldn't tolerate in my relationships, my finances, and my future. The woman who had panicked over an empty bank account was evolving into someone who could empty accounts herself when necessary, someone who could walk away from security if it came at the cost of self-respect. Lisa arrived at my house within an hour of my call, armed with coffee, pastries, and the practical wisdom of someone who had watched too many friends stay too long in relationships that diminished them. She read Daniel's accidental text message with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a car accident, then immediately shifted into action mode, helping me plan the logistics of extricating myself from a marriage that had become toxic. The afternoon was spent in methodical preparation. I photographed important documents, transferred personal funds to my new individual account, and began the process of separating our shared digital lives. Each step felt like reclaiming territory that had been lost gradually over months of Daniel's deception and manipulation. By evening, I had created the foundation for a life that didn't depend on his honesty, his financial contributions, or his presence. When Daniel arrived home that evening, I was ready for him. The dining room table was set not for dinner, but for the conversation that would end our marriage. The bank statements were there, printed copies of his text messages, and a simple typed letter explaining that I was filing for divorce. Everything was organized, clear and final in a way that left no room for negotiation or false reconciliation. His reaction was immediate and telling. Not remorse for his betrayal, not concern for my well-being, but anger that I had discovered his deception and wasn't willing to ignore it for the sake of maintaining our domestic arrangements. The mask finally slipped completely, revealing someone who had viewed our marriage as a convenience rather than a partnership, someone who expected me to be grateful for whatever attention he chose to give me, while he pursued more interesting relationships elsewhere. The argument that followed was brutal in its honesty. Daniel accused me of being unreasonable, jealous, and incapable of understanding the complexity of his relationship with Vanessa. I responded with quiet fury about his dishonesty, his financial betrayal, and his fundamental disrespect for our marriage vows. The conversation lasted hours but resolved nothing, because we were arguing from completely different value systems about what marriage meant and what loyalty required. By midnight, Daniel had packed a bag and left for what he claimed would be a few nights at his friend Kevin's apartment while we both cooled off and reconsidered our positions. His departure felt like a relief rather than a loss, the first peace I had experienced in our home since discovering the empty bank account. The house felt cleaner without his presence, less contaminated by secrets and lies. I spent that night planning my immediate future with a clarity that surprised me. The legal steps for divorce, the practical considerations for living independently, and the emotional work of rebuilding my identity outside of a marriage that had been slowly poisoning my sense of self-worth. Each decision felt empowering, a step toward becoming someone I could respect rather than someone who tolerated disrespect from the person who should have cherished her most. The woman who woke up the next morning was fundamentally different from the one who had discovered the empty bank account just days earlier. I was no longer trying to save a marriage to someone who had already left it emotionally. I was no longer making excuses for behavior that was inexcusable. I was finally ready to fight for my own worth with the same energy I had once invested in protecting his feelings and preserving our relationship. The battle was just beginning, but for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt equipped to win it. Daniel had underestimated the woman he married, assuming that my love and loyalty made me weak rather than recognizing the strength it took to build the life he had so casually destroyed. He was about to discover that the same determination I had used to support our marriage could be redirected toward dismantling it, and toward building something better in its place. The next phase would test everything I thought I knew about myself, about relationships, and about what I was willing to fight for. But I was no longer the woman who had trusted blindly and loved without boundaries. I was becoming someone who understood that real love requires mutual respect, that trust must be earned and maintained, and that my worth was not negotiable regardless of who failed to recognize it. The empty bank account that had started this crisis was about to become the foundation for a much fuller life, one built on honesty, self-respect, and the kind of love that enhances rather than diminishes the people it touches. Daniel had taught me what I wouldn't accept, and now I was ready to discover what I deserved. The days following Daniel's departure blurred together in a strange rhythm of mundane tasks and earth-shattering revelations. I found myself cataloging our shared possessions with the detached efficiency of an estate appraiser, mentally dividing 7 years of accumulated life into his, mine, and contested categories. The coffee maker he had researched so thoroughly became a symbol of decisions made together that now felt like ancient history. Each item told a story of the couple we used to be, people who seemed naive and trusting from my current perspective. My morning routine shifted dramatically without Daniel's presence. Instead of brewing coffee for two while planning our day together, I sat alone at our kitchen table with legal documents spread before me like battle plans. James Harrison, the divorce attorney Lisa had recommended, had provided me with a comprehensive checklist of information to gather. Bank statements, property deeds, insurance policies, and employment records that would determine how our shared life would be divided into separate futures. The deeper I dug into our financial records, the more evidence I found of Daniel's systematic deception. Small transfers I had never questioned, explained away as work expenses or client reimbursements, now revealed a pattern of redirecting our money toward purposes I had never authorized. The yoga studio where Vanessa worked had received several payments labeled as wellness consultations that I now understood were probably private sessions that had nothing to do with my husband's professional development. Kevin Martinez, Daniel's colleague at the tech company, reached out to me 3 days after Daniel moved out. His uncomfortable phone call revealed details that painted a clearer picture of my husband's double life. The late nights Daniel claimed were spent on client deadlines had often been dinners and social events where Vanessa was his consistent companion. Kevin's guilt over staying silent was palpable as he described watching Daniel introduce Vanessa as his close friend at company functions I had never been invited to attend. The most devastating revelation came when Kevin mentioned that Daniel had been openly discussing his unhappiness in our marriage for months, describing me as controlling and financially obsessive to colleagues who barely knew me. The man who had promised to honor and protect me had been systematically undermining my reputation while building sympathy for his affair among people whose opinions might matter in our professional community. Each conversation had been carefully crafted to position himself as the victim of an unreasonable wife rather than the perpetrator of betrayal. I scheduled a meeting with Kevin at a coffee shop downtown, needing to hear these details in person rather than processing them through uncomfortable phone conversations. His nervous energy was evident as he fidgeted with his coffee cup, clearly regretting his decision to reach out but committed to providing me with information he felt I deserved to know. The picture he painted of Daniel's workplace behavior was of someone living two completely separate lives with remarkable compartmentalization. According to Kevin, Daniel had been bringing Vanessa to team lunches for months, introducing her as a consultant working on various projects that provided plausible cover for her regular presence in his professional sphere. Their body language and intimate conversations had been obvious to everyone except, apparently, the wife who trusted him completely. Kevin described watching them share inside jokes and finish each other's sentences in ways that clearly indicated a relationship far deeper than professional collaboration. The timeline Kevin provided was particularly painful because it overlapped with some of our happiest moments as a couple. While I had been planning our anniversary dinner and dreaming about our future family, Daniel had been laying the groundwork for a relationship that would ultimately replace everything we had built together. The vacation we had taken to the Oregon coast just 2 months earlier, where Daniel had seemed so present and affectionate, had apparently been interrupted by constant texting with Vanessa about her upcoming surgery. Kevin's most disturbing revelation was that Daniel had been researching divorce attorneys weeks before I discovered the empty bank account, suggesting that his plan had always been to end our marriage rather than simply fund Vanessa's medical expenses. The careful timing of the financial transfers, the systematic preparation for his departure, and his apparent surprise at my anger all made more sense when viewed as components of an exit strategy rather than an impulsive act of generosity. I left that coffee meeting with a completely different understanding of my husband's character and intentions. The man I had been trying to reconcile with was someone who had been planning to leave me for months while maintaining the pretense of a loving marriage. Every recent conversation about our future, every intimate moment we had shared, every plan we had made together had been performed by someone who was already mentally and emotionally divorced from our relationship. The drive home took me past the yoga studio where Vanessa worked, and I found myself pulling into the parking lot before I had consciously decided to stop. The building was a converted warehouse in southeast Portland, the kind of trendy space that attracted young professionals seeking wellness and community. Through the large windows, I could see people flowing through poses in the golden light of late afternoon, their movements graceful and synchronized in ways that suggested regular practice and commitment. I sat in my car for nearly an hour, watching people enter and leave the studio, wondering if any of them knew about the drama their instructor had caused in my life. The rational part of my mind recognized that Vanessa might be completely unaware of Daniel's marital status, that she might believe she was involved with a separated or divorced man rather than someone who was actively betraying his wife. But the emotional part of me struggled with the reality that another woman was benefiting from my husband's generosity, while I dealt with the financial and emotional fallout. When Vanessa finally emerged from the building, I recognized her immediately from the photos I had found on Daniel's social media accounts. She was exactly what I had expected: that young, athletic, with the kind of effortless beauty that comes from good genes and careful self-care. Watching her load yoga mats into a luxury car that was clearly newer and more expensive than anything our joint income could have afforded confirmed my suspicions about where our money had been going beyond just the surgery. The temptation to confront her directly was overwhelming, but I managed to resist the impulse that would have provided emotional satisfaction while potentially damaging my legal position. Instead, I took photos of her car, the license plate, and the studio's exterior, adding them to the growing file of evidence that would support my case for financial misconduct during our divorce proceedings. Every piece of documentation felt like reclaiming power from a situation that had made me feel completely helpless. My brother Michael called that evening as I was organizing the evidence I had gathered throughout the day. His protective anger on my behalf was comforting, but his practical questions about my financial security forced me to confront realities I had been avoiding. Our joint credit cards, the mortgage on our house, and shared debts that would need to be resolved regardless of how I felt about Daniel's betrayal. The emotional work of ending my marriage was complicated by practical considerations that required clear thinking rather than righteous anger. Michael offered to help me move out of the house immediately, but I realized that leaving would put me at a disadvantage in property negotiations while Daniel remained in possession of everything we had accumulated together. Instead, I decided to stay and force him to be the one who felt uncomfortable in the space he had contaminated with his deception. The house was as much mine as his, and I wasn't going to be driven from my home by his inability to live with the consequences of his choices. The legal consultation with James Harrison provided clarity about my options and realistic expectations for the divorce process. His calm professionalism was reassuring as he explained how adultery and financial misconduct would be handled under Oregon law. The documentation I had been gathering would be crucial in establishing Daniel's pattern of deception and protecting my interests in property division and spousal support considerations. Harrison's assessment of our financial situation was sobering but not devastating. While Daniel had depleted our emergency fund, our house had significant equity, and my stable income would support independent living once the divorce was finalized. The bigger concern was ensuring that Daniel couldn't continue accessing our joint accounts or using our shared credit for expenses related to his relationship with Vanessa. Immediate financial separation was essential to prevent further damage. The process of disentangling our shared accounts felt like performing surgery on our life together. Each institution required different forms and procedures, but the cumulative effect was the systematic dismantling of the financial partnership that had supported our marriage. Removing Daniel's access to our joint credit cards provided immediate relief, knowing that he couldn't continue funding his relationship with Vanessa using resources that were partly mine. My workplace became a refuge during this period, the familiar demands of client projects and creative deadlines providing structure that my personal life lacked. Lisa's steady support helped me maintain professional focus while processing the emotional upheaval of my dissolving marriage. Her practical suggestions about self-care and stress management kept me functional during days when the magnitude of Daniel's betrayal threatened to overwhelm my ability to think clearly. The photography exhibition that had seemed so important weeks earlier now felt like a lifeline to my identity outside of my marriage. The images I had captured during happier times with Daniel took on new meaning as documentation of a relationship that had been less authentic than I had realized. But the artistic vision and technical skill they represented belonged entirely to me, reminders of capabilities and passions that existed independently of my husband's support or approval. Preparing for the exhibition provided positive focus during the darkest days of discovery and legal preparation. The gallery space in the Alberta Arts District represented new beginnings and creative community that had nothing to do with Daniel or the life we had shared. Selecting and framing my best work became an exercise in self-advocacy, choosing pieces that represented my vision rather than compromising to accommodate someone else's preferences or comfort level. Daniel's attempts to contact me became increasingly desperate as he realized that I was serious about ending our marriage rather than simply expressing temporary anger about his financial decisions. His voicemails evolved from casual dismissal of my concerns to elaborate justifications for his behavior to pleading requests for face-to-face meetings where he could explain his perspective more thoroughly. Each message revealed more about his self-perception as the victim of my unreasonable expectations rather than the perpetrator of systematic betrayal. The most revealing communication came in the form of a long email where Daniel attempted to rewrite the history of our marriage, describing me as emotionally distant and financially controlling in ways that justified his decision to seek companionship elsewhere. His narrative portrayed Vanessa as someone who appreciated his generous nature and understood his professional pressures in ways that I apparently never had. The psychological manipulation was breathtaking in its audacity, attempting to make me question my own memories and perceptions of our relationship. I forwarded Daniel's email to Harrison, who recognized it as a classic example of someone attempting to establish grounds for their behavior while inadvertently providing evidence of their deception. The detailed timeline Daniel provided meant to justify his actions actually documented the systematic nature of his affair and the premeditated quality of his financial misconduct. His attempts at manipulation were becoming valuable additions to my legal case. The loneliness of those weeks was offset by unexpected sources of support and connection. Neighbors who had seemed like casual acquaintances revealed themselves as genuine friends, offering practical help and emotional encouragement as word spread about my situation. The community I had built in Portland extended beyond my marriage, providing a foundation for rebuilding that I hadn't fully appreciated while I was coupled. My sister called from Seattle every few days, offering to visit and provide additional support during the most difficult parts of the divorce process. Her perspective as someone who had successfully navigated her own divorce years earlier was invaluable, helping me understand that the intense emotions I was experiencing were normal and temporary rather than permanent damage to my ability to trust and love in the future. The investigation I had been conducting into Daniel's finances revealed additional accounts and assets that he had apparently hoped to hide during our divorce proceedings. Small investment accounts opened in his name only, using funds that should have been disclosed as marital property. Each discovery reinforced my decision to hire competent legal representation rather than attempting to handle the divorce cooperatively with someone who had proven himself incapable of honesty or fair dealing. Sleep became elusive during this period, my mind cycling through memories and revelations that refused to quiet down when I needed rest. The guest bedroom where I had been sleeping since Daniel's departure felt like neutral territory, free from the intimate associations of our shared space but also lonely in ways that highlighted how much of my identity had been intertwined with being part of a couple. Dreams became a battleground where my subconscious processed the reality that the man I had loved and trusted had been systematically deceiving me for months. Some nights brought dreams of reconciliation that left me feeling guilty and confused upon waking. Other nights featured scenarios where I discovered even worse betrayals. My sleeping mind apparently convinced that the revelations I had already endured were just the beginning of deeper deceptions yet to be uncovered. The practical work of separating our lives provided welcome distraction from the emotional processing that threatened to consume all my mental energy. Changing beneficiaries on insurance policies, updating emergency contacts at work, and revising estate planning documents that had assumed Daniel would be my partner for life. Each administrative task represented another step toward independence and self-determination. My relationship with our shared friends became complicated as news of our separation spread through our social circle. Some people seemed to choose sides immediately, while others attempted to maintain relationships with both of us in ways that felt awkward and forced. The couples we had socialized with regularly seemed particularly uncomfortable, as if our divorce was a contagious condition that might threaten their own relationships. Lisa's friendship became even more precious during this period as she navigated the delicate balance of supporting me while maintaining professional relationships that included Daniel's colleagues. Her loyalty was unwavering, but she helped me understand that rebuilding my social life would require developing connections that existed independently of my former marriage and the community Daniel and I had shared. The therapy sessions I began attending provided additional perspective on the patterns that had allowed Daniel's deception to continue undetected for so long. Learning about manipulation tactics and emotional abuse helped me understand that my failure to recognize his betrayal wasn't due to stupidity or naivety, but rather to the systematic way he had undermined my instincts and encouraged me to doubt my own perceptions. Understanding the psychology behind Daniel's behavior provided some relief from the self-blame that had been consuming my energy since discovering his affair. The therapist helped me recognize that the trust and loyalty I had brought to our marriage were strengths rather than weaknesses, qualities that would serve me well in future relationships with people who deserved them rather than exploiting them for their own advantage. The most difficult part of this period was accepting that the Daniel I had fallen in love with might never have existed in the way I believed. The possibility that his caring attention and generous spirit had always been performance rather than authentic character was almost unbearable to consider. Yet evidence continued to accumulate that suggested our entire relationship had been built on a foundation of careful presentation rather than genuine compatibility and shared values. Kevin provided additional information about Daniel's workplace behavior that supported this theory. According to multiple colleagues, Daniel had always been someone who presented different versions of himself to different audiences, tailoring his personality and opinions to maximize his appeal to whoever he was trying to impress. The consistency I had valued in our private relationship might have been just another performance, carefully maintained to preserve the domestic stability that supported his professional and social aspirations. This realization was simultaneously devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant that the love I had felt was based on illusion rather than reality. Liberating because it meant that losing Daniel wasn't actually losing someone real, but rather waking up from a dream that had prevented me from finding authentic connection with someone who could love me honestly rather than strategically. The woman I was becoming through this process felt stronger and more discerning than the one who had married Daniel 7 years earlier. The naive trust that had made me vulnerable to his manipulation was being replaced by wisdom about red flags and boundaries that would protect me in future relationships. The pain I was experiencing was the price of education that would serve me for the rest of my life. As winter deepened in Portland, I found myself appreciating the dramatic weather in new ways. The rain that had once felt oppressive now seemed cleansing, washing away the remnants of a life that had been contaminated by secrets and lies. The gray skies that had depressed me in previous years now felt honest and authentic in ways that mirrored my growing appreciation for truth over pleasant facades. The photography I was creating during this period reflected my evolving perspective on beauty and meaning. Instead of the romanticized landscapes that had characterized my earlier work, I found myself drawn to images that captured resilience and transformation. Abandoned buildings being reclaimed by nature, storm damage that revealed unexpected strength in damaged trees, urban decay that was being transformed into something new and vital. These new images would anchor my upcoming exhibition, providing visual metaphors for the personal transformation I was experiencing. The gallery opening would mark not just the debut of my latest work, but my emergence as someone who had survived betrayal and chosen growth over bitterness. The woman who would stand beside those photographs would be fundamentally different from the one who had started this journey, stronger and more authentic because of what she had endured and overcome. The morning that changed everything started with an ordinary Tuesday routine that had become my new normal. I was preparing for a client presentation at the agency, reviewing mock-ups spread across the kitchen table while sipping coffee from the mug Daniel had always claimed made the worst brew. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had discovered his mug actually made superior coffee once I stopped automatically deferring to his supposedly superior taste in everything from kitchenware to life decisions. My phone buzzed with what I assumed would be another work notification, but the sender's name made my stomach drop. Rachel Thompson. After days of ignoring his increasingly desperate voicemails and manipulative emails, I had almost convinced myself that he had finally accepted the reality of our situation. The message preview showed just enough text to make me realize this wasn't another plea for reconciliation or attempt at emotional manipulation. The full message, when I opened it, contained words that would haunt me for weeks afterward, not because they were surprising but because they confirmed everything I had suspected about his true feelings. Don't worry about the money, she's worth more than you ever were. Her recovery is going better than expected and we're planning to travel together once the divorce is final. Hope you can find someone who appreciates your particular qualities. I read the message 3 times before the full weight of its cruelty settled into my consciousness. This wasn't a misdirected text meant for someone else, as I had initially hoped. The deliberate reference to our divorce proceedings and his casual mention of travel plans made it clear that Daniel had intentionally sent this message to hurt me, to drive home the point that he had moved on completely while I was still processing the destruction of our marriage. The calculated nature of his communication was breathtaking in its callousness. The man who had once promised to love and protect me had crafted a message designed to inflict maximum emotional damage, using his intimate knowledge of my insecurities and vulnerabilities as weapons against me. The phrase "your particular qualities" was especially devastating because it referenced conversations we had shared about my struggles with self-worth and social anxiety. I screenshot the message immediately, knowing that this level of emotional abuse would be relevant to my divorce attorney's strategy. But beyond its legal implications, Daniel's text represented a moment of absolute clarity about who he really was and what our marriage had actually meant to him. The mask had finally slipped completely, revealing someone capable of profound cruelty toward the person who had loved him most completely. The trembling in my hands made it difficult to dial James Harrison's number, but I knew I needed legal counsel about how this communication might affect our proceedings. His calm professionalism provided an anchor of stability as he explained that Daniel's message could potentially support claims of emotional abuse and might influence decisions about spousal support and property division. More importantly, Harrison assured me that Daniel's behavior was providing clear evidence of his character that would be apparent to any judge reviewing our case. After ending the call with my attorney, I sat in the silence of what had once been our shared kitchen, processing the reality that the man I had married was someone I had never truly known. The Daniel who had sent that message was incapable of the love and respect I had believed formed the foundation of our relationship. Everything I had grieved about losing had been an illusion, a carefully maintained performance that had finally been abandoned now that he no longer needed my emotional and financial support. The anger that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced, a white-hot fury that demanded immediate action rather than the careful planning I had been pursuing through legal channels. I wanted to respond with equally devastating words, to wound him as deeply as he had wounded me, to make him understand the pain he had caused through his systematic betrayal and casual cruelty. But even in my rage, I recognized that responding emotionally would only provide him with satisfaction and potentially damage my legal position. Instead, I forwarded his message to Lisa with a simple note asking her to call me when she had a moment to talk. Her response was immediate and fierce, expressing the outrage I felt but couldn't safely direct toward Daniel without compromising my own interests. Her willingness to be angry on my behalf provided the emotional release I needed while maintaining the disciplined approach that would serve me better in the long term. Lisa arrived at my house within an hour of receiving Daniel's message, armed with takeout lunch and the kind of righteous indignation that only true friendship can provide. She read his text multiple times, her expression growing darker with each repetition as she processed the deliberate cruelty of his words. Her immediate suggestion that we drive to his temporary apartment and confront him directly was tempting but ultimately counterproductive given the legal strategy we had been developing. The conversation with Lisa helped me understand that Daniel's message, while painful, was actually a gift in disguise. His willingness to communicate his true feelings so explicitly eliminated any remaining doubt about whether our marriage could be salvaged or whether he deserved another chance to explain his behavior. The man who could send such a message to his wife of 7 years was someone who had never truly valued our relationship or respected me as a person worthy of basic human decency. We spent the afternoon analyzing every aspect of Daniel's communication, from the timing to the specific word choices that revealed his mindset and intentions. The reference to Vanessa's recovery suggested that her surgery had been successful and that they were making plans together that extended far beyond the medical emergency Daniel had used to justify his initial deception. His mention of travel indicated a level of commitment to their relationship that contradicted his claims that helping her had been simply an act of compassion for a colleague in crisis. The most revealing aspect of his message was the casual assumption that I would struggle to find someone who could appreciate me, a prediction that said more about his character than mine. The man who truly knew and loved me would never question my worth or ability to attract genuine affection from someone capable of recognizing my value. His inability to see my positive qualities had always been a limitation of his perception rather than a deficit in my character. Lisa's analysis of the situation helped me reframe Daniel's cruelty as confirmation that I was making the right decision in ending our marriage. Someone capable of such deliberate emotional abuse was not someone I could ever trust again, regardless of any apologies or explanations he might offer in the future. The message had revealed his true nature in ways that years of careful observation had failed to uncover. The evening brought another wave of communication from Daniel, apparently realizing that his previous message had crossed a line that even he couldn't justify. His follow-up text attempted to walk back the cruelty of his earlier words, claiming that he had been stressed and hadn't meant to sound so harsh about our situation. The transparent attempt at damage control only reinforced my conviction that his original message had revealed his authentic feelings rather than representing a momentary lapse in judgment. His apology, when it came, was a masterpiece of non-accountability that blamed his harsh words on work stress, concern for Vanessa's health, and frustration with the divorce process rather than acknowledging the deliberate cruelty of what he had written. The man who had once claimed to take full responsibility for his mistakes was now demonstrating his inability to own the consequences of his choices, even when those consequences were simply the accurate interpretation of his clearly stated intentions. I deleted his apology messages without responding, recognizing that any communication from me would only encourage his attempts to manipulate the narrative around his behavior. The silent treatment I was maintaining wasn't intended as punishment but rather as protection for my own emotional well-being and legal interests. Every interaction with Daniel had the potential to provide him with ammunition for his revised version of our marriage's failure, where my reactions to his betrayal would be portrayed as evidence of my unreasonable and vindictive nature. The therapy session I attended that week focused on processing the emotional impact of Daniel's message and developing strategies for maintaining my equilibrium during what would likely be an increasingly contentious divorce process. My therapist helped me understand that Daniel's cruelty was a predictable response from someone whose carefully constructed facade had been exposed, a desperate attempt to regain control by inflicting pain on the person who had witnessed his deception most completely. Understanding the psychology behind Daniel's behavior provided some protection against the emotional damage his words were intended to cause. His need to hurt me was evidence of his own pain and shame about the choices he had made, projected onto me because acknowledging his own responsibility would require a level of self-awareness he didn't possess. The man who could send such a message was someone who was fundamentally unhappy with himself, using cruelty toward others as a way to avoid confronting his own moral failures. The revelation that Daniel was planning to travel with Vanessa forced me to confront practical questions about our shared assets and financial obligations that I had been hoping to resolve through negotiation rather than litigation. His willingness to spend money on leisure travel while our divorce was pending suggested that he was either hiding additional assets or planning to deplete our joint resources in ways that would disadvantage me in our final settlement. I scheduled an emergency meeting with James Harrison to discuss strategies for protecting my financial interests given Daniel's apparent willingness to prioritize his new relationship over his legal and moral obligations to our divorce agreement. Harrison recommended immediate action to freeze our remaining joint accounts and prevent Daniel from accessing funds that should be preserved for equitable distribution between us. The legal steps required to protect my interests felt like an escalation of hostilities that I had been hoping to avoid, but Daniel's behavior had made cooperation impossible. His message had demonstrated that he viewed our divorce as an opportunity to punish me rather than a process for fairly resolving our shared obligations and dividing our joint assets. The collaborative approach I had initially preferred was no longer viable given his willingness to prioritize hurting me over reaching a reasonable resolution. The paperwork required to freeze our accounts and restrict Daniel's access to our joint credit cards provided a concrete sense of taking action to protect myself rather than simply enduring his abuse. Each signature felt like reclaiming power that I had gradually surrendered over months of trying to understand and accommodate his increasingly erratic behavior. The woman who signed those documents was someone who prioritized her own protection over maintaining false peace with someone who had proven himself unworthy of consideration. Daniel's reaction to discovering the frozen accounts was immediate and explosive, confirming that my decision to take protective action had been necessary and appropriate. His voicemails became increasingly aggressive as he demanded explanations for my vindictive behavior and threatened legal action against what he characterized as my attempts to punish him financially for ending our marriage. The complete lack of self-awareness in his outrage was stunning given that he had initiated our financial crisis by stealing our emergency fund for his mistress's surgery. The contrast between Daniel's fury over restricted access to our joint assets and his casual dismissal of the financial devastation he had caused provided clear evidence of his fundamental selfishness and entitlement. The man who had depleted our savings without consultation was now outraged that I had taken steps to prevent further unauthorized access to funds that were legally as much mine as his. His inability to recognize the irony of his position confirmed that he had never viewed our marriage as a true partnership. Kevin Martinez called to warn me that Daniel was spreading his version of our divorce throughout their workplace, painting me as a vindictive wife who was using legal maneuvers to punish him for his friendship with Vanessa. The narrative Daniel was constructing portrayed himself as the victim of my jealousy and financial manipulation, conveniently omitting his theft of our emergency fund and his systematic deception over months of conducting an affair. Kevin's loyalty in providing me with this information was touching, but his descriptions of Daniel's behavior at work revealed someone who was completely committed to avoiding responsibility for his choices. The gossip Daniel was spreading about our divorce forced me to confront the reality that our mutual friends and professional acquaintances were being fed a version of events that bore little resemblance to the truth. His willingness to damage my reputation in order to protect his own was another form of abuse, using social manipulation to isolate me from support systems while positioning himself as someone deserving of sympathy rather than accountability. I decided to break my silence with a carefully crafted email to our closest mutual friends, providing a factual account of Daniel's financial betrayal and the timeline of events that had led to our separation. The message was professional and restrained, focusing on documented facts rather than emotional reactions, but it provided enough information to counter the narrative Daniel had been constructing about our marriage's failure. The responses to my email revealed which friendships were based on genuine affection and which had been maintained primarily for social convenience. Several people expressed shock at learning the truth about Daniel's behavior, while others seemed uncomfortable with having to choose sides in a situation they had preferred to view as a mutual incompatibility rather than a clear case of betrayal and abuse. Lisa's unwavering support during this period reminded me that authentic relationships could survive difficult revelations about character and choices. Her willingness to defend me against Daniel's attempts to control the narrative about our divorce provided a model for the kind of loyalty and integrity I deserved in all my relationships. The contrast between her consistent support and Daniel's manipulative behavior highlighted how dramatically my standards for acceptable treatment had been lowered during my marriage. The photography exhibition that had been scheduled for the following month took on new significance as a public statement about my resilience and independence. The images I had selected told a story of transformation and strength that would counter any narrative about my being a bitter or vindictive woman destroyed by divorce. The professional success I was achieving independently of Daniel's support or approval demonstrated that my worth wasn't dependent on his recognition or validation. Preparing for the exhibition provided positive focus during the most difficult days of processing Daniel's cruelty and protecting myself from his continued attempts at manipulation. The creative work that had always been my refuge became a source of empowerment, visual proof of capabilities and vision that existed entirely separate from my role as someone's wife. The woman who would stand beside those photographs at the gallery opening would be someone who had survived betrayal and chosen growth over bitterness. The nights remained difficult, my mind cycling through Daniel's message and the casual cruelty it revealed about someone I had trusted completely. Sleep was elusive when my subconscious was processing the reality that the man I had shared a bed with for 7 years was capable of such deliberate emotional violence. The dreams that did come were often nightmares featuring scenarios where I discovered even worse betrayals, my sleeping mind apparently convinced that his revealed character suggested possibilities for deception I hadn't yet uncovered. But the daylight hours brought increasing clarity about my own strength and resilience. Each decision I made to protect myself rather than accommodate Daniel's continued selfishness felt like reclaiming territory that had been gradually surrendered over months of trying to understand behavior that was fundamentally incomprehensible to someone with normal empathy and moral awareness. The woman I was becoming through this process was someone I could respect and admire. The legal strategy James Harrison developed focused on Daniel's pattern of financial misconduct and emotional abuse rather than simply seeking an equitable division of our assets. His message about my worth provided clear evidence of his character that would influence any judge's decisions about spousal support and property distribution. The cruelty that had been intended to hurt me was actually strengthening my position in negotiations that would determine our financial futures. Daniel's attempt to schedule a face-to-face meeting to clear the air about our divorce was politely declined through my attorney's office, maintaining the protective boundaries I had established to prevent further manipulation or abuse. His frustration at being unable to control the narrative through direct contact was evident in increasingly desperate communications that revealed someone who was finally facing consequences for choices he had made without considering their impact on anyone else. The transformation I was experiencing went beyond simply ending a marriage to someone who had betrayed me. I was discovering personal strength I hadn't known I possessed, professional capabilities that had been overshadowed by my focus on maintaining domestic harmony and social connections that existed independently of my coupled status. The life I was building in the aftermath of Daniel's betrayal was fuller and more authentic than anything I had experienced during our marriage. The woman who had panicked at discovering an empty bank account just weeks earlier had evolved into someone who could freeze joint assets, hire competent legal representation, and refuse to engage with someone who was trying to manipulate her into accepting responsibility for his moral failures. Daniel's cruelty had backfired spectacularly, providing the final push I needed to stop making excuses for inexcusable behavior and start fighting for my own worth with the same energy I had once invested in protecting his feelings. The message that was supposed to devastate me had actually liberated me from any remaining doubt about the rightness of my decision to end our marriage. Someone capable of such calculated cruelty was not someone whose love or approval I needed to seek. The man who had written those words was a stranger wearing my husband's face, and I was finally ready to stop mourning the loss of someone who had never actually existed in the way I had believed. The morning of my photography exhibition arrived with the kind of crisp Portland sunshine that made everything feel possible. I stood in my empty house, surrounded by boxes and the systematic dismantling of a life I had once believed was permanent, feeling more excited than nervous about the evening ahead. The woman preparing for her first solo gallery show was someone I barely recognized from just 2 months earlier, someone who had learned to channel pain into power and betrayal into breakthrough. The final divorce decree had been signed 3 days earlier. James Harrison's meticulous documentation of Daniel's financial misconduct and emotional abuse resulting in a settlement that exceeded our initial expectations. Daniel had been required to reimburse the emergency fund he had stolen, pay additional compensation for his unauthorized use of joint assets, and cover my legal fees as acknowledgement of the damage his deception had caused. The money felt less important than the official recognition that his behavior had been unacceptable and legally actionable. Michael had driven down from Seattle to help with the final moving preparations, his protective presence a comfort as I prepared to leave the house that had been both sanctuary and prison during the final months of my marriage. He loaded boxes into his truck with the efficient determination of someone who understood that physical action could provide emotional healing, his quiet support allowing me to process the magnitude of change without having to explain or justify my feelings to anyone else. The new apartment I had found in the Alberta Arts District felt like stepping into a different version of my life, one where creativity and independence took precedence over domestic compromise and financial security. The loft space was smaller than what Daniel and I had shared, but every square foot belonged entirely to me, decorated according to my preferences without having to consider anyone else's opinions or comfort level. The exposed brick walls and industrial lighting provided the perfect backdrop for my photography, transforming my living space into an extension of my artistic identity. Lisa had spent the morning helping me arrange the final details for the exhibition opening, her excitement about my professional breakthrough providing a welcome distraction from the emotional weight of my recent experiences. The gallery director, Maria Santos, had been enthusiastic about the story behind my latest collection, recognizing that personal transformation often produced the most compelling artistic work. The images I had created during the darkest period of my life told a story of resilience that resonated with viewers who had faced their own moments of crisis and renewal. The photographs themselves chronicled my journey from devastation to empowerment, beginning with stark images of urban decay and abandonment that reflected my initial shock at discovering Daniel's betrayal. The middle section captured moments of transition and struggle, trees growing through concrete, buildings being demolished to make way for new construction, natural forces reclaiming spaces that had been artificially controlled. The final images celebrated transformation and new growth, vibrant colors emerging from unexpected places, beauty found in authenticity rather than artifice. Preparing for the evening required more than just artistic preparation, it demanded emotional fortitude to face a room full of people who would be celebrating my success while knowing the personal cost that had made it possible. Some of the attendees would be mutual friends from my marriage, people who had witnessed the dissolution of my relationship with Daniel and were now seeing the person I had become in its aftermath. Their presence would test my ability to own my story rather than feeling shame about my marriage's failure. The dress I chose for the opening was a deep emerald green that brought out my eyes and made me feel powerful rather than vulnerable. Standing in front of my bedroom mirror, applying makeup with steady hands, I barely recognized the confident woman looking back at me. The transformation went beyond surface changes to something fundamental in my posture and expression, a self-possession that came from surviving the worst kind of betrayal and discovering that I was stronger than I had ever imagined. Kevin Martinez had surprised me by asking if he could attend the exhibition, his guilt over his silence during Daniel's affair apparently motivating his desire to support my professional success. His presence would be a bridge between my past and future, someone who had witnessed both my vulnerability and my strength, who could appreciate the magnitude of my transformation from betrayed wife to independent artist. His friendship had evolved from obligation to genuine respect during the months since my divorce. The gallery space in the Alberta Arts District buzzed with the kind of creative energy that had drawn me to Portland originally, before marriage and domestic responsibilities had gradually narrowed my world to more conventional concerns. Hanging my photographs on those white walls felt like reclaiming territory that had been lost during years of prioritizing relationship harmony over personal growth. Each image represented not just artistic achievement but psychological breakthrough, visual proof of my ability to transform pain into something meaningful and beautiful. Maria Santos introduced me to collectors and critics who were interested in both my current work and future projects, conversations that opened possibilities for exhibitions and commissions that could support my transition to full-time artistic practice. The business cards I collected represented opportunities that had nothing to do with my marital status or domestic arrangements, professional relationships based entirely on my capabilities and vision rather than my role as someone's wife. The first hour of the opening passed in a blur of introductions and congratulations that felt surreal after months of legal battles and emotional reconstruction. Watching strangers respond to my photographs with genuine appreciation reminded me that my worth wasn't dependent on Daniel's recognition or approval, that my artistic vision had value that existed independently of his ability to see it. The validation felt different from the encouraging words of friends and family, more objective and therefore more powerful in rebuilding my confidence. Lisa moved through the crowd with the pride of someone who had witnessed my entire journey from devastation to triumph, her introduction of me to potential clients and collaborators feeling like a celebration of friendship as much as professional achievement. Her loyalty during the darkest months of my divorce had proven the value of relationships based on mutual respect rather than convenience or social expectation. Standing beside her at my first solo exhibition felt like vindication of every difficult decision I had made to prioritize authenticity over false harmony. My brother Michael arrived fashionably late, his presence immediately noticeable as he surveyed the crowd with the protective instincts of someone who had watched his sister rebuild her life from scratch. His quiet pride in my accomplishment was evident in his careful examination of each photograph, his understanding of the personal history behind the images making his approval particularly meaningful. Having family support that wasn't contingent on maintaining relationships that diminished me felt like a luxury I had forgotten to appreciate during my marriage. The surprise guest of the evening was Dr. Patricia Williams, the therapist who had helped me navigate the psychological aftermath of Daniel's betrayal. Her presence at the exhibition felt like a completion of the healing process, professional support evolving into personal celebration of my growth and success. Her ability to witness both my vulnerability and my strength provided a unique perspective on the transformation that the photographs documented. As the evening progressed, I found myself in conversations about future projects and artistic directions that excited me more than anything had during the final years of my marriage. The possibility of a travel photography series, documentary work with local nonprofits, and collaborative projects with other Portland artists opened creative horizons that had been closed during years of prioritizing domestic stability over personal growth. The woman planning those future projects was someone who valued adventure and challenge over security and predictability. The financial independence that my divorce settlement had provided gave substance to dreams that had been theoretical during my marriage. The money Daniel had been required to pay back, combined with my share of our joint assets, provided enough foundation to take creative risks without jeopardizing my basic security. For the first time in years, I could make decisions based on passion and artistic vision rather than practical concerns about bills and mortgage payments. Several gallery visitors asked about the story behind my recent work, curious about the transformation that was evident in both the images and my presentation of them. I found myself able to discuss my divorce and personal growth without shame or defensiveness, owning my experience as someone who had survived betrayal and chosen growth over bitterness. The narrative I shared focused on empowerment rather than victimization, transformation rather than loss. The evening's most meaningful moment came when an older woman approached me near the end of the reception, tears in her eyes as she thanked me for creating art that honored the strength required to leave relationships that no longer served growth and happiness. Her own story of divorce and reinvention at 65 provided perspective on my experience at 35, reminding me that courage and transformation were possible at any stage of life. Her words felt like benediction on the journey I had completed and the new chapter I was beginning. As the crowd began to thin and the official reception wound down, I stood alone among my photographs for the first time since hanging them that afternoon. The images looked different, surrounded by the energy and appreciation of people who had connected with their message, more powerful and significant than they had seemed in my apartment studio. The artistic vision that had emerged from my personal crisis felt validated and valuable in ways that extended beyond my own healing process. The gallery sales that evening exceeded my expectations, collectors and art lovers investing in pieces that would hang in their homes and offices as reminders of the beauty that could emerge from difficult circumstances. Each sale represented not just financial success but recognition that my artistic voice had something valuable to offer the world. The woman who had once defined herself primarily through her marriage was discovering an identity based on creativity and professional accomplishment. Maria Santos approached me as I prepared to leave, her enthusiasm about representing my work in future exhibitions, providing confidence about my transition to full-time artistic practice. The conversation about upcoming opportunities and long-term career development felt like stepping through a door that had been closed during years of prioritizing relationship stability over personal ambition. The partnership she offered was based on mutual benefit and shared vision rather than emotional dependency or domestic obligation. The drive home to my new apartment took me through the Alberta Arts District, past studios and galleries where other artists were pursuing their own visions of creative independence. The neighborhood felt like a community of people who understood that authentic self-expression sometimes required difficult choices about relationships and lifestyle priorities. My place among them felt earned rather than assumed, based on artistic merit rather than social connections or marital status. The apartment that welcomed me back that night was filled with flowers from friends and family who had celebrated my exhibition opening, their fragrance filling the space with sweetness that felt earned through struggle and growth. The congratulations cards displayed on my kitchen counter represented relationships that had survived my transformation from married woman to independent artist, connections based on genuine affection rather than social convenience. The exhaustion that followed the evening's excitement was the pleasant fatigue of accomplishment rather than the drain of emotional labor that had characterized so many social events during my marriage. Preparing for bed in my own space, surrounded by evidence of my professional success and personal growth, felt like the culmination of a journey that had begun with devastating betrayal and evolved into empowering transformation. The photographs from the exhibition that I had kept for my personal collection hung on my bedroom wall, visual reminders of the strength I had discovered during the darkest period of my life. The woman who had created those images was someone I could respect and admire, someone who had transformed pain into beauty and isolation into independence. Looking at them before sleep, I felt gratitude for the journey that had led me to this moment of wholeness and possibility. The lawsuit that Daniel had threatened never materialized, his legal counsel apparently advising him that his position was indefensible given the documented evidence of his financial misconduct and emotional abuse. The silence from his attorney's office felt like final acknowledgement that his behavior had been legally and morally indefensible, regardless of whatever narrative he had constructed to justify his choices to himself and others. Vanessa Cole had apparently recovered fully from her surgery, her social media posts showing her traveling with Daniel to destinations that our joint income had never been able to afford. The source of their upgraded lifestyle remained mysterious, but I no longer cared about the details of their relationship or financial arrangements. The man who had chosen her over our marriage was someone else's problem now, free to demonstrate his character to a new victim who would eventually discover what kind of person she had chosen to love. The freedom to make decisions based entirely on my own preferences and priorities felt intoxicating after years of compromise and accommodation that had gradually eroded my sense of individual identity. Planning weekend trips to photograph Oregon's coast and mountains without having to consider anyone else's schedule or interests reminded me of pleasures I had forgotten during my marriage. The woman exploring those landscapes with her camera was someone who belonged entirely to herself. The professional opportunities that emerged in the weeks following my exhibition provided structure for a life that no longer revolved around domestic responsibilities or relationship maintenance. Gallery representation, commercial photography contracts, and teaching opportunities at local art centers created a professional identity that existed independently of my personal relationships or marital status. The business cards that identified me as a professional photographer rather than someone's wife felt like reclaiming territory that had been surrendered gradually over years of marriage. The dating prospects that friends began mentioning felt premature but not impossible, suggestions that I might eventually be ready to share my rebuilt life with someone who deserved access to the woman I had become. The idea of romantic partnership no longer terrified me as it had immediately after my divorce, but it also didn't feel necessary for completeness or happiness. The woman I had become was sufficient unto herself, capable of creating meaning and joy without depending on someone else's validation or presence. The therapy sessions that had been essential during my divorce became less frequent as I developed confidence in my ability to navigate challenges and opportunities without professional guidance. Dr. Williams' final assessment was that I had successfully transformed a traumatic experience into personal growth, developing emotional resilience and self-awareness that would serve me well in future relationships and professional endeavors. Her recognition of my progress felt like graduation from a curriculum I had never intended to study. The anniversary of discovering Daniel's empty bank account passed without the emotional upheaval I had expected, marked instead by quiet reflection on the distance I had traveled from victim to survivor to someone who thrived independently. The woman who had panicked over missing money had evolved into someone who generated her own income through work that fed her soul as well as her bank account. The transformation felt complete in ways that surprised me with their thoroughness. The Christmas card I received from Kevin Martinez included a note expressing his continued admiration for my resilience and professional success, his friendship having evolved from guilt-motivated obligation to genuine respect for the person I had become. His updates about Daniel's workplace behavior suggested that my ex-husband's character issues extended beyond our marriage, affecting his professional relationships and reputation in ways that validated my decision to end our relationship rather than continuing to enable his dysfunction. The new year brought gallery interest from other cities, opportunities to exhibit my work beyond Portland's supportive but limited art market. The possibility of showing my photographs in Seattle, San Francisco, and eventually New York felt like validation of artistic vision that transcended the personal circumstances that had inspired it. The woman planning those future exhibitions was someone who belonged on that stage, whose voice deserved to be heard by larger audiences. The gratitude I felt for the journey that had brought me to this point included appreciation for Daniel's betrayal, strange as that seemed even to me. His cruelty had forced me to discover strength I hadn't known I possessed, creativity that had been suppressed during years of prioritizing relationship harmony over personal growth, and independence that felt more valuable than the security I had lost. The woman he had discarded was someone who had become too powerful and authentic for his comfort, someone who deserved better than what he had been capable of providing. The life I was building in the aftermath of my marriage felt more aligned with my authentic self than anything I had experienced during 7 years of trying to be the wife that Daniel claimed to want. The work that filled my days was meaningful and profitable, the relationships that surrounded me were based on mutual respect and genuine affection, and the future that stretched ahead was filled with possibilities that excited rather than intimidated me. Standing in my apartment on a February morning, coffee in hand and sunlight streaming through windows that looked out on a neighborhood of artists and dreamers, I felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had survived the worst and discovered that she was capable of creating something beautiful from the wreckage. The woman reflected in those windows was someone I could love and respect, someone whose worth wasn't negotiable regardless of who failed to recognize it. The story that had begun with devastating betrayal had evolved into one of transformation and triumph, proof that endings could become beginnings when faced with courage and determination. The woman who had once defined herself through her marriage had discovered an identity based on creativity, strength, and independence that no one could take away. Daniel had given me the greatest gift possible by showing me exactly who he was and forcing me to discover exactly who I could become. The phone calls from potential clients and gallery directors that filled my calendar reminded me daily that my worth was recognized and valued by people who mattered, that the work I was creating had significance beyond my personal healing journey. The professional success I was building belonged entirely to me, earned through talent and determination rather than inherited through relationship or circumstance. The future that stretched ahead was filled with uncertainty, but it was uncertainty I controlled rather than anxiety about someone else's choices and their impact on my security and happiness. The woman planning that future was someone who trusted herself to navigate whatever challenges and opportunities arose, someone who had learned that she was capable of surviving anything and thriving in circumstances she had never imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.